This is Kiryas Joel, a Hasidic village north of New York City. It has its own government of elected Satmar Hasidic men. It is populated almost entirely by Satmar Hasidic Jews, some 30,000, I believe, today. This is where I grew up and spent the formative years of my life. I was there 25 years and went through some of my most major life milestones, including getting married there at 18 and becoming a mother to my son, Seth, soon after. Kiryas Joel is a fascinating story as far as subcultures go. That is something I'm really fascinated by. From its inception, Kiryas Joel was mired in legal battles. In many ways, it's a story about America, about the United States, about how subcultures, closed religious groups operate here, and how they interact with the legal system to make it possible for them to exist, taking advantage of America's strong emphasis on freedom of religion, and yet coming at odds with the separation of religion and state. The case study of Kiryas Joel is really fascinating to those who are interested in American law and how it makes religious sub-communities possible. One of the earliest battles of Kiryas Joel, one that is so famous that it is taught to law students everywhere in the United States, is the case of Kiryas Joel's public school. Kiryas Joel had a problem with serving its population of children with special needs, and they decided to form their own public school. This was a problem to some in the community as well as to many outside. Why? Because public schools are places that are supposed to be neutral religiously. They are, after all, public, and they need to abide by the separation of church and state. A core group of dissidents arose inside of Kiryas Joel, and they argued that it is unacceptable for Kiryas Joel to have a public school because religion has to be taught, including to children with special needs, and a public school at essence deprives them of chinuch, which is the idea of religious inculcation. From the outside, the argument was different. It was that a public school in Kiryas Joel would not, by definition, abide to the separation of church and state because it would actually teach religion. And so this became a national debate. Some of the players you'll see here is the Hasidic mayor, Abe Weider.
There is a need for children to get an education appropriate by the Constitution.
And Mrs. Malka Silberstein, the school principal, who was the mother of a daughter with Down syndrome and became a very strong voice for children with disabilities. And also Joseph Waldman.
Joseph Waldman, W-A-L-D-M-A-N.
Probably one of the most famous dissidents. The Kiryas Joel School District battle went all the way to the Supreme Court with 5 trials. The last one, the judges ruled in favor of Kiryas Joel, and that's how Kiryas Joel ended up with a public school that operates until today as a school specifically for children with special needs. The battles waged by the dissidents, with Joseph Waldman at its head, continued well after the public school was settled. There were many fights, and as a child I remember these politics, which is what we call them, existing on the periphery of my childhood. They didn't impact me, but I knew the names of these leading figures who were the bad guys in my childhood. With time, a figure stepped into the scene to represent Waldman. This was lawyer Michael Sussman. He was not himself Hasidic. He was not Orthodox even, but he became so involved that even he became an infamous character to my childhood. And ultimately, when a synagogue was established by the dissidents, it was nicknamed the Sussman Shul. Sussman's role of existing on this periphery, of being an outsider, yet becoming so close to this community, and of litigating so many fascinating battles, has interested me as an adult. And so, today's interview is a conversation with lawyer Michael Sussman on his perspective and memories of representing the dissidents of the Kiryas Joel battle.
I remember going with my father to that fire. I remember getting a call, and he just started crying. He got there, smoldering. And I remember, though, the scene. It was a very overwhelming scene. My father cried at the arson site where the women were running with their children and the men were there screaming and yelling, and it was very explosive.
Hello and welcome or welcome back to this channel. I'm Frida Weisel, and here on this channel I explore topics related to Judaism, oftentimes especially Hasidic Judaism, which is the world that I come from and left. I recently read the book American Shtetl by the scholars Nomi Stelzenberg and David Myers. It's about the exceptional world that I grew up in, Kiryas Joel, a all Hasidic village in Hudson Valley, which has a Hasidic caste that leads it from the political, civic realm to the religious realm. The thesis of the book, and I'll link the book in the video description, religious subcultures thrive in America, essentially. It goes into how Hasidim use the American legal system to build their village. And one of the major figures in that story is the lawyer Michael Sussman, who I remember his name from my own childhood, actually. So I had a real interest to hear his version, his recollections of what went down in the formation of this Hasidic village, its legal battles. And so I invited him on my channel today. Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Sure. It'd be a very interesting conversation since we come from such different places and probably very different views of this issue. So I'm happy to be here and engage in a conversation with you about it. Very happy to.
Great. Okay. I don't actually have a lot of views on the issue because I was a young child through a lot of this, and I knew your name because it was spoken in very heated conversation, but I was just a child overhearing it. So it's especially interesting for me to go back and look from an adult perspective at what happened. But I think it'll be really interesting to my viewers because the story of Kiryas Joel, the village that I grew up in, is so interesting. The legal battles that were waged to make it into what it is today is interesting to everyone, I think, who is interested in like American communities. So let's see what you remember. Let's start from the beginning. How did you get involved? Like, what was that moment? When was it that you got involved in the Kiryas Joel legal dispute?
Well, a man named Joseph Waldman called me on the telephone, and he told me that there was going to be an election for a newly created school district, public school district, and that he wished to be a candidate for the office of trustee of the school district. There are going to be 7 individuals elected. And he told me that he'd gotten a call from the lead rabbi in the community and had been told that his children would all be expelled from the school if he did not withdraw his candidacy. So that's the first I directly had contact with Kiryas Joel.
When was this? Which year?
1989 or 90. I can't remember which year, but it was one of those 2 years.
This was like a good 10 years of Kiryas Joel being established as a Hasidic village in Orange County, New York. Right.
Well, Kiryas Joel at that point was part of the town of Monroe. And there was still a great deal of battle at that point as between the town and the village as to who would be doing what with regard to zoning, planning, and other issues. But this particular controversy was not about that. Later controversies became more about that. This was about Mr. Waldman and his 7 children, and could he run for the public school board? And the prohibition against him running, which struck me as constitutionally absurd. But that was the beginning. And then we went to court.
Let's pause for a second and explain. Kiryas Joel already had their own school district at that time?
No, this was the beginning of the school district. This was the first election.
To form.
It had formed on the 5th occasion, as the book explains. The Supreme Court of the United States allowed there to be this district. The other 4 occasions, the Supreme Court of the United States had said there could be no school district because it was being created to serve and only to serve religious community. And the Supreme Court had problems with church and state on that issue. But finally, through a bunch of machinations, which are also explored in the book, by the way, the district was created.
Okay.
I had not really been involved very much in the struggle about its creation, had views on it, but I had no particular involvement. And the subject of its creation was being hotly debated in Kiryas Joel. There were many in Kiryas Joel who did not want the district. They did not want public district because they were concerned that they would not be able to teach religion in a public school district the way they wished to teach religion. On the other hand, the group that wanted it spoke of the financial benefits of having it because there were a number of classified children in Kiryas Joel in need of special services who would be eligible to get state funding for their special needs if a district were created. The problem was the tension between saying publicly, we're not going to involve religion in this, which is what they had to say to get it, and the religious beliefs of the community. And
okay,
so that's the context we're in.
Got it. So I just want to pause here and explain to you that a lot of my viewers don't even know what Kiryas Joel is. So we have to start from the very beginning to explain to them, when you got the call from Joseph Waldman, there was a whole backstory with a school district that had already played out, right? By that point, it had already played out.
Meaning there had been this struggle to create it.
Yes.
It was just then in its infancy. This is the first election to the school board that's being held. So the district,
but it's already been at the Supreme Court?
5 times.
Okay, so can you explain for the viewer, let's start there because people will have no idea what the context of the school district is. So let's explain the story of this. It was a historic Supreme Court decision, right? After those 5 times. But let's start there. Assume that the viewer knows yet nothing. They've just come from Mars and you're trying to tell them this story. Okay.
The story is that a number of families moved up to a part of Monroe, New York in Orange County from essentially Williamsburg to create the beginnings. This is in 1973, 4, 5, that era, the beginnings of a community. They, of course, did not utilize the public schools. And part of their vision was to create yeshiva, which they did, and obviously a big synagogue, which they did in Kiryas Joel, which is the name of this community. So after, again, years of being here and the community growing, there was as your viewers may or may not know, a division between the Satmar, within the Satmar, because the founder of the order, so to speak, the group, died without any sons. And his 2 nephews vied for who would be the leader. So this is basically the context we're in. And the leader in Kiryas Joel was one of the nephews. The leader in Brooklyn was the other nephew, and they did not get along. Okay, so you have these 2 communities.
Which is the second nephew?
Oh, you had the Aaronites, right?
Oh, okay.
So
this is
maybe before your time. I don't know, but
because this is a much later succession feud. The original succession feud was Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum and his nephew Moshe and his late wife Reb Tzalta Feiga. But that's besides the point.
There was a feud, though. The point is
there was a feud
in the community, however you want to define the players. I don't think I'm wrong about that, but whatever it was. So the point is we're now in the late 1980s, really started in the mid-1980s, and there was a provision of federal law called the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. And this provision allowed school districts, public school districts, to get funding for children who were classified. Classified meant they had some form of disability which needed special services. Parenthetically, I was doing those cases for those children and their families since it started, the act started. And this happened to be an interesting conjunction. But here we were, and I had nothing really to do much with Kiryas Joel up until this call from Waldman. The call from Waldman came after the Supreme Court had finally said, you can have a school district, which had been, as I said, very hotly contested. And the reason it had been hotly contested was because most people did not feel there would be a separation of church and state. And if you're going to have a public school district, you have to have a separation of church and state. So how are they going to have a public school district dominated by the rabbi and the theocracy, essentially, which would control whatever went on in the school district? That was the problem. It didn't seem consistent with the notion of a public school. So finally, it got resolved, and they were creating this district. They already had a village. And Mr. Waldman was one of the founding families of Kiryas Joel in Orange County. His family was one of the founding families. So, it was not surprising that he wanted to run for the school district board. He was 35 years old, 36, 37, that age range. He had 7 children already. They were in school. So he wants to run. And this is what got me involved.
Did he have children with special needs? Because the school district was going to be for children with special needs only, right?
Right, but that was not one of the criteria that anyone was operating under. You're right, he didn't, but none of the people, as far as I know, who were elected had such children. And that wasn't the issue. The issue was that he, at that point, was on the other side of this dispute which had enveloped the community and was in its relative infancy, by the way. The dissidents, as they came to be called, were, if you will, triggered and inspired by this as much as preceded this. I mean, there were families that were disaffected from the rabbi and Kiryas Joel, but this is what really brought out the whole movement that followed over the next decade, as far as I could tell. So we went to court and we said to the judge, he has a right to run for a public school board without any retaliation. You can't say to someone, we're creating a school board, but if you run, your children would be kicked out of the school they're in. Well, the other side of it was, they're in a private school. They're in a parochial school. That school controls itself. They want to kick them out, they can kick them out. They're not a public school. Now, there'd never been a case in New York before in which a private or parochial school had been forced to admit or readmit or maintain children in this sort of situation. But there'd also never been this sort of situation before. There'd never been a case where a public school district was being created, someone was trying to run for the public school district, and the people in power said, you better get your kids, you're going to have to get your kids out of this private school if you run for a public school board. That had never happened either. So it was totally virgin ground from a legal point of view. And that was the beginning.
Did Waldman have proof of what he alleged, that he was threatened, that his children will be kicked out?
No one disputed it. The children, in fact, had been kicked out of school because he didn't agree. So the kids were out of school. When I got into the case, they were out already, out a couple of days. And we went an emergency way back into the Supreme Court of the state, which is the lowest court in the state. And we asked the judge to order their readmission. So there was no issue as to whether he was right or not about why they were being kicked out. That was not disputed. What was disputed is, did this parochial school, private school, have the right to kick them out? I argued no, they argued yes. So that was my initiation into all of this.
I see. I personally didn't doubt it for a second, by the way. Threatening to kick children out of school is the most powerful tool that the leadership can wield, although perhaps less so today since there are more school options. But I was just curious how you would bring such allegations to the court. What was your first impression of Joseph Waldman, who ended up being the face of villainy in Kiryas Joel for kids like me? He became the bad guy from our perspective, and that's about as much as I knew.
So I really didn't have any direct experience at that point with the Satmar community. My legal practice was not really focused in Orange County yet. I had just really started more vigorously working in our county, and I viewed him as a very dedicated figure. In other words, he was bucking this whole system. I viewed him as very courageous, because how could you, over the years I've learned much more, but not so much about him, but about the whole dynamics there. It may not have been as homogenous as I thought at the beginning, but at that point, the way it looked to me is, the whole world was against him. And he had the courage to stand up and say, and I remember saying at one point, you want to run for the school board, you're going to get about 3 votes. Who's going to vote for you? The whole community seems to be in lockstep behind, the grand rabbi, the rabbi here at least. So I always found it was a bit ironic to me, but he wanted to run. And the other part of it that was, I don't know if it's amusing, but it's ironic. Joseph and those who were supporting Joseph didn't really believe there should be a public school, because they felt that there should not be a separation of religion and the education. They didn't feel it was possible to be true to Satmar ideals and have a school which didn't have religion. And he felt that the people in charge were hypocrites. They were going to do that anyway. They were just telling the world they weren't. So they were lying. And he was going to tell the truth. And basically, there shouldn't really be a district. So he wants to be a school board member, even though on some level, he believes the whole enterprise is corrupt and based on sand. So there were all these issues. But the reality, as you pointed out very correctly a couple of moments ago, is there were no other schools. So if his children were going to be excluded from the school, where were they going? Nowhere. They had nowhere to go. It was an interesting, but in terms of on a personal level, I mean, we got along. We were both, young, relatively young people who had strong ideals, and his ideals and mine, again, ideologically, we weren't in anything approaching the same place. But, as a civil rights lawyer and a constitutional lawyer, that wasn't the issue to me. The issue to me was, could you have a public school district and exclude people's children from the school they were in if they ran? That was the issue, which I thought was an important issue. But
do you think he was driven by an idealism, that he believed that the Kiryas Joel leadership was hypocritical in creating a public school that was classified as a public school, but where they intended to treat it as a private school in some ways?
Absolutely. He was, and I always thought he was totally right about that from everything I saw then and later. He also felt that, and this was the most direct issue, that you're creating a public school district and then you're saying to the people in your community, the rabbi is going to dictate the slate and no one else can run. Well, how is that possible? It's not a theocracy. America is not a theocracy. And I heard what you said earlier about sub-communities and that being part of the American experience. But there's always been a great deal of tension about that position because of the role that religion begins to play in the public sector. So he felt, and I think he was right about it, that, if we're having a public school district, we're having a public school district. If we're having a private school district run by, the synagogue or the rabbi, that's different. But the two should not be admixed. That's what he said. And I think he was right about that. So the point is, regardless of who was right and wrong, the rabbi came to court. The judge was in the court. 1,000 people came to court. It was the first time magnetometers were ever used in Orange County in a court.
What is that?
Magnetometer, to see if anyone was carrying weapons. And several knives were actually found in people's possessions. I'm not saying anyone had a malintent would use them, but that was what was found. So, we went in and the judge heard the case, and the judge sided with me and said that the rabbi has to admit the children. And he didn't. The rabbi didn't admit the children. So about a week later, maybe 10 days later, we were back in court. And the judge famously looked at the grand rabbi, the rabbi in his big mink stole and all that, and said, surrounded by all these old men in their, all their garb, and said to the rabbi, the keys to the jail are in your pocket. You will either let these children back into school or you're going to go to jail. So that was when they capitulated and the children were readmitted into school. But really, that was the beginning of the dissident movement, publicly at least, in our county. And from there, all sorts of, the next 9 years were devoted to all sorts of craziness that I was somewhat in the middle of.
Wow, that's so interesting. I remember not the Waldmans, but a family that was also allied with the dissidents. We called them B'nai Yoel. I remember their children were expelled and then readmitted. And I have sad memories of these children walking through the school being essentially like outside, but they
ostracized is the word.
Ostracized because everyone didn't know what to make of them. They were kicked out and now they're back, but they weren't wanted. And it's so strange to look back from an adult perspective. And to us, what Joseph Waldman and his ilk were doing, they were bad and they were terrible. Joseph Waldman was the worst person. For years, we didn't patronize shops run by his family because he had gone to the government and he had told on our community, which is, I'm sure you're familiar, the concept of Masida, and that's a sin, and he committed that sin. So that's why he was the bad guy. And it's really interesting to hear. What do you think motivated him to put so much on the line?
I think Jews in general, including myself, and I'm not a Satmar, obviously, many Jews have very, very strong beliefs and ideals. I think this is part of our culture in some deep way. I think it manifests in many myriad of ways, not all of which are the same. I have a brother who runs a kollel and is a major rabbi in Chicago. I think what Yaakov and I share is a passion for ideas and our strongly held beliefs about what's right and wrong in the world, that we don't necessarily agree. But I think the point is that I'm not surprised that a person would come and conclude that something is really fundamentally flawed and would fight for it. And that's what he was doing. And he wasn't alone. In fact, there were many people who felt the way he did. As often happens in these situations, sometimes very few have the courage to really stand up, and then others will be magnetized by their example, and you'll say join. But I never had any sense that he was ill-motivated. There are people, of course, they say, well, someone's vying for attention. That to me was absurd. Whose attention? In the broader community, Kiryas Joel has always been reviled. And I don't see that a person objecting to the regime in Kiryas Joel is going to then all of a sudden become a hero to the broader community. I don't think that's what happened. Many people respected his courage outside of Kiryas Joel, but there was no place for him to go outside of the community, really. He was only really speaking to the community, I thought, the Brooklyn and Monroe communities.
Yeah.
So, no, I never had any feeling that he had any ill motive or, obviously all sorts of character assassination occurs. It's occurred to me and against me over the years. Everyone attributes whatever motive they want, but I didn't see it, and I still don't see it.
What have your feelings towards Kiryas Joel been, and how have they evolved over the years?
Well, in 1997, I was in a court case in which the federal judge asked me, do you want to dissolve Kiryas Joel? And that was a case that was really being championed by Zalman Waldman, Joseph's older brother. And by then there was that's where the synagogue that they sometimes call Sussman Synagogue over there on the corner, that's when that synagogue was at stake, and it was built following that case. And there was a settlement reached, a financial settlement, which was paid to the dissidents by the majority, as well as the creation of a community resolution board to try to deal with the disputes. But I saw blood on the staircase of the main synagogue. I saw rocks being thrown at people going to vote. I had to get the polling place moved out of Kiryas Joel because of the violence against various individuals who were trying to vote. So, I mean, I saw a lot of ugliness there. And, you know, I have ambivalent feelings and mixed feelings. I don't have uniform feelings. You know, in 2001, when I first ran for county executive, the group in Brooklyn brought me to Brooklyn to endorse me. You know, these are the dissidents, and they, of course, controlled Brooklyn at that point. And I remember we went to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and there were probably 15,000 people there. It was huge.
Wow.
And they were carrying me around like they do at a wedding.
On a chair.
On the chair, all over the Navy Yard. And I remember when I spoke, I said that what you need and deserve is a seat at the table. But you're part of a broader community. And it's the height of arrogance to think that you're better than anyone there in Orange County, or that you'd have more of a dessert for anything than anyone there. You should be part of the conversation about the infrastructure of the county, the water, the sewer, whatever else is needed. But you're not better than everyone else. And I said that to them. And I believe that. And I think that the community has at times created a sense of entitlement that's absolutely alienating to everyone else. And I've been upset by that over the years. On the other hand, you know, I think that there's a joy in Hasidism, a kind of cultural expression, which I find very attractive. It's not, you know, one thing or the other. You know, many times over the years, women would call me from the community and tell me about oppressive circumstances that they had in the community. And I had to deal with that because, you know, I couldn't just ignore them. They were telling me some very brutish kinds of things. So it's a very complex situation. I don't think it can be simplified in 2 minutes. And of course, I've been very involved over the years with Yafet as well, to be honest. And you know what Yafet is? Well, Yafet is a group of individuals who not just Satmar, but grew up in a number of the Hasidic or ultra-Orthodox communities and groups, and have essentially argued, to simplify it, that they were undereducated, that the 3 hours of secular education was never provided to them. Many of them were barely literate, having come out of years of education in these schools. And they started an organization to try to essentially enforce what was then state law to provide 3 hours of secular education to students. And, you know, that's been a very controversial issue, but the founding of it happened basically in my living room.
Really?
That's right. I think that the religious sphere, as you did start out with in this discussion, in American life is critical. It's provided inspiration and support and psychological guidance, if you will, and direction to millions of people of different faiths. The problem is that when one group attempts to impose its religious views on everyone else, whether it's historically the Catholics on issues like abortion or any such imposition, in my opinion, it poses very serious issues.
Yeah.
So, you know, and when a group, you know, obviously the tradition that Kiryas Joel implements is a rather strict division in the gender roles of men and women. And again, I think that that's born of a certain interpretation, biblical interpretation, if you will, interpretation of our rules that people adopt. But when that's put in the broader society, it creates all sorts of issues. So, these are very deep subjects. Can't talk about them in a couple of minutes, and I don't say I can, but I'm just pointing out that these are very profound subjects. And I've in a way been honored to think about them.
Well, I think obviously there is the issue of what's called liberalism. If you create a very liberal society, you give space for illiberalism to lead the way. I think also, as I hear you speak, what I would say as someone who grew up in Kiryas Joel, I think there's a lot of valid criticism of Kiryas Joel. But my experience as a child there was not defined by these fights. I'm sure for the Waldman's kids and the other families in the dissidents, it was largely defined by these fights. For us, it was very much on the periphery. I think what you see by being involved in these legal spaces is the ugly side of things. It's just like, if you look really closely at New York City history, you might see a lot of ugliness in leadership, but the everyday person would have a very different experience. So like, I just want to say, of course, I think there was so much ugliness, and looking back at the fight between leadership and the B'nai dissidents, it saddens me, and I feel especially for the kids. But also, I think it's a particular part of the story, and I want to hear more of that story while keeping in mind that it is the ugly side, or one of the ugly sides of a complicated world. So can you speak, what happened? So you get involved first when his kids are expelled, and then you stay involved. Who's funding the legal battles? Because they seem to go to court every other day.
Never mattered to me.
What do you mean?
I didn't care about the money. It wasn't an issue to me.
You didn't charge?
Charged, it was minimal. Wasn't ever an issue to me. I had my own family and 7 children, but I was not
really
focused on making money from this, what I saw as a kind of a very serious set of struggles. So
I see. So can you then tell us your personal, a little bit, I want to hear about your personal views, how you would describe them, because you seem very motivated by your convictions.
I went to Harvard Law School. I was at the top of my class. I never considered doing anything other than being a civil rights and constitutional lawyer. I went to the Justice Department out of Harvard in the Civil Rights Division. When in February of 1981, the new administration told us that the imperiled group in America were white men, I left, because I didn't believe that for a minute. And I went to the NAACP national office, where I brought big civil rights cases around the country for people of color. And I did that through the first number of years of my career, particularly in Yonkers, where I desegregated schools and housing patterns, put in place districts from which people of color could get elected, which had never been in place before, from whence Andrea Stewart Cousins, for instance, came, because that's where she got her start. And I did civil rights litigation, both at the early stages. The only civil rights litigation that mattered were for people of color. But then obviously, as the laws expanded, women became protected. I started doing early domestic violence and sexual harassment litigation for women, and did some of the early pioneering cases in that. And as I said earlier, I worked in special education law for the early parts of that law being enacted and implemented. And I've worked with people with disabilities, adults, as well as all sorts of categories of civil rights. So my essential view of my role and my values is that we have a society that's erected any number of obstacles to people succeeding based on impermissible characteristics. And my job has been to try to eradicate that and let people be all they can be. So when I see a situation like Kiryas Joel, it's obvious to me, the way I look at the world, that that's not the same model. It's a totally different model. Mm-hmm. People there, in my opinion, don't have that opportunity. But I also acknowledge that people can choose not to, as opposed to it being inflicted on them. If you're a religious person and you decide, particularly if you're a woman, that you're going to play a certain role in your community, and you're not going to fully develop your own intellectual capacity, that's your decision. I can't force you to. If you're going to have a certain role, cultural role, religiously defined role, it's not for Michael Sussman to tell you you're wrong. I don't say you're wrong. That's for you to say about your own life. I'm concerned about the imposition of restrictions. If someone's imposing on you and telling you you can't leave, for example, you can't be someone else, that's a problem to me. If you choose to involve yourself in that and have 14 children or 18 children or 2 children, that's your choice from my point of view. So, yeah, I mean, I'm impelled by a concern that we're not where we need to be in some measure because people's opportunities have been restricted. And obviously the forms of those restrictions in our society are well known and not so well known. But there's no question they've existed, and we're still working our way through with different subgroups in our society to a place where they can optimally participate. And we're not there by a long shot. So that's some of my beliefs.
Can I ask what year you were born?
1953.
So you came of age in the 60s and 70s, when that was very much a moment.
Oh, when I was 14, I was deeply involved in politics already. When I was 5 years old, I was reading the New York Times. My father helped integrate the garment industry in the South and give African-American people a chance to be something other than just sweepers. My parents are very committed to the same kinds of ideals I've always been committed to, largely, I'm sure, through their teaching. So, yeah, I mean, I did come of age in that time, and I do continue to hold the same values that I've held really my entire life, conscious life. I've not seen anything in my human experience that's caused me to deviate from these views. And my own view is, when you talk about illiberalism, the illiberalism that I see is almost always an imposition by someone on the freedom of someone else. And I find those forms of illiberalism to be intolerable. And the law that I've tried to enforce is a law which says that you have a right to live in communities. And I've, by the way, tried to enforce this for Jews as much as anyone else. When there were issues in Woodbury of Jews being in various situations, Woodbury's in Orange County, and moving into communities and not being able to put up a sukkah, for instance, and not being able to express their religious beliefs in the broader, more secular community they moved into, I fought for them because I felt those impositions were totally inappropriate and irrational. So it's not an anti or pro-Jew, or I'm not, that's not how I think. I'm not anti-police or pro-police. When police improperly shoot and kill someone, I sue them. I've also represented many police officers. So it's not a doctrinaire, group-based philosophy that I have, but it is one that recognizes the history. You have to recognize the history where we are and, where we hope to get. And the question of how these, the communities you define as religious communities are going to play a role in that is very significant. Anyway.
I understand. Yeah, I understand. I also appreciate what you're saying. What?
You wanted to schmooze, you said. So here we are.
Yeah, no, this was very interesting. I understood that your politics reflect a certain moment, and it's very interesting to see it in relation to Kiryas Joel. I think a lot of young people who grow up now and are very civic minded and justice oriented maybe are trained into different priorities. You have to be cognizant of minorities, of various genders. I think the issues are different. Whereas you reflect a time where there was desegregation and the debate around desegregation. And I think that's very interesting. With regards to Kiryas Joel, also, I totally appreciate what you're saying about it's all good and well when people observe their religion until someone doesn't have a choice, of course, and then the legal system comes into play. So what
else? It really doesn't, though. I mean, I don't think it does. I mean, that's the whole point. I don't think the legal system in general has come into play. I mean, I think the legal system has been on the sidelines. And I don't have any idea, because I don't go to Kiryas Joel. palm tree now, and I don't try to stir up anything. That's not my goal, honestly. But I don't do any public opinion polls there. I don't have any idea what I would find if I did and whether they would even be answered in a candid way. But what I'm really saying is that people who are there, and I'm not just speaking about Kiryas Joel, and I'm not speaking of it as a cult either. I mean, it sounds like I'm almost talking about it as a cult, where people are being forced to stay against their will. I'm not suggesting that. What I am suggesting is that, you said it yourself, when someone like Joseph Waldman comes up, he's against apparently a whole other community, which does not have a very diverse set of views. It has a very homogenous set of views. And my view of humankind is that that's unnatural. It's not natural that you're going to have 30,000 people who are living in America in a particular place, and they're going to have the same views about everything. That's not the way I think about the world. So I think there is a degree of imposition that's inherent in that. Now, again, a degree. And there's nothing I can do about it, and there's nothing the law can do about it either. Because the law doesn't say, do you want to be here? If you don't want to be here, come with me. I'm the law. You can go live somewhere else. That's not the way the world works. People individually have to have, if they feel it, the courage, and that's what Yafet was about, really, to come out of that community and say whatever they want to say. And they may be right or wrong, by the way. I was interested in the fact that there were a large number of people, from what I knew, relatively large number, who came out and said, wait a minute. The education is deserving our ability to even make a choice as to who we are going to be. That's what they were really saying. We want to have a choice. We want to know what's in the world. And they won't give us that choice because they won't teach us anything other than... Now, I tell you about my brother, which is an interesting story. I had this conversation with my rabbi brother. I remember where we were. We were at my aunt's house in Queens. And he knew I was working with Yafet, and we had a conversation. And he said to me, Michael, you want me to study that? You want my students to study that? It would take 10,000 years to learn all we need to learn. We don't have time for that. Okay? I said to him, but you're here. You're in the United States. You don't know if every one of those people want to be immersed in that only. You have to give them knowledge of where they... No, we don't. Okay? So this is my own brother. He says we have to study Jewish law, Jewish tradition, Jewish books, Jewish whatever he's studying, because it takes us 10,000 years to study it all. I said to him, well, if it's going to take you 10,000 years, it's really immaterial. If you spend a few hours a day on the other thing, you're never going to get to any of it anyway. So what's the discussion about? But anyway, that was literally a conversation. And I respect his position. I don't agree. But, anyway.
I hear you. I don't want to talk about the education issue. Yafet and the education issue is its own separate story and such a big topic. But I do think civil liberties and liberties within religious communities and how the law does or doesn't step in is very interesting. And also, I find it really interesting that you took this on as what seems to be a passion case. Like, I don't know how you would call it when you do something as a lawyer that you're doing because of your convictions, but you are not totally pro bono.
This has been my entire career, though, so it's not really unique to this group.
I mean, how do you raise 7 children then?
Win cases, and you get fees when you win cases from the other side. So you have to be good at doing it. But the point is, you don't take money. You say, how did they pay you? I mean, at some point in time, these folks would pay what they could pay, but it wasn't an issue to me of, okay, you're going to have to spend, they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars defending themselves. It was never anything in that order of magnitude. It wasn't anything that would be materially affecting their ability to take care of their children. Let's put it that way. And I never tried to. Again, my view, we get back to more philosophical issues. I don't think you can have a legal system the way we have a legal system, because 90% or more of the people can't participate. That's just the truth. They can't, because the monies lawyers charge, that precludes them from participating. And I see it every day here. I've seen it every day for the 48 years I've been practicing law. You just you cannot call this a system that has any rectitude for principles of equality. It doesn't. Now, how you change that's a whole other story. That's another discussion again for another day. But so my view has always been try to give people access to the courts when needed, or else what do we have?
Yeah, a lot to think about. So there was a big moment in your career working with Kiryas Joel that's mentioned in the book where, and you've alluded to it, you were asked by the court if you want to dissolve Kiryas Joel, right? Or your party. Can you tell that whole story? And again, imagine that the viewer knows nothing. What led up to that moment?
Good question. So again, there was a village of Kiryas Joel. The village of Kiryas Joel had authority to control zoning and building within a village because it was a secular village. It wasn't a theocracy. It was a public entity. But it was also very clear that this public entity was disfavoring by then the dissidents who wanted to build things and do things in Kiryas Joel. So the standards that were being applied in giving a permit for a building were very different for one group than another group. And they came to me again, the dissidents, and said, we're trying to build a synagogue on this particular location and we're not being allowed to build it. Why not? Well, we're the dissidents. Well, that's not a good enough reason. You can't run a public village based on a religious dispute, or else the church and state thing gets all muddled together again. So that's the background. So
they're dissidents. They're dissidents because they don't believe that the rabbi who is rabbi should be rabbi. They don't accept the legitimacy of the rabbi. But what does that have to do with the village? The village is a public juridical entity. The rabbi has one vote. Now, this is different from in the synagogue. I get it. In the synagogue, the rabbi has the only vote, but that's not what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a community. On what grounds are they actually denying the construction of the synagogue? Grounds that a court found laughable. So, I don't even remember the specific, there were so many of these things going on. This was the whole tenor of the community. One group was not allowed to do. Okay. So they were coming to me, we want to do. All right. Well, what do you want to do? We want to build here. Okay. What's the problem? Well, we can't get a permit. Why can't you get a permit? Some pretextual reason. Who knows what it was? So, we'd fight that internally, and the village was supposed to have a process to appeal, and you'd appeal. There really was it was very ad hoc. And then finally we end up in court, and the court is now forced to decide whether they're being denied this based on their religion, which sounds ironic because they're the same religion in a broad sense as the other group, but they're just a different subset of the religion. So the court is hearing the testimony of Abe Weeder, particularly, who is the longtime leader of the community. Okay? And it's totally... He's the mayor. The mayor. It's totally nuts. Exactly what we're saying. I said, Mr. Mayor, did you review the project? I said, why didn't you... They're them. They're them. What do you mean they're them? They're like a different group. So I said, what do you mean they're a different group? This is what's going on the witness stand. And the judge is watching this. And, it's like the Marx Brothers. It's hilarious. I mean, I was trying not to laugh because it was really, and I've been trying to explain to the majority group, you can't do this. This isn't the way you can run a government. You want to have a government, you want to have a village. That's different from saying, I want to live in the town of Monroe, which has the town of Monroe law, and they'll administer the law, and you live here. Okay, no, we don't want that. We want to run. Well, if you're going to run a government, you have to run a government according to secular principles, not your religious principles. No, but everything's our religious principles. They go first. All right, so go to court then and explain to the federal judge that your religious principles go first, and therefore you don't like their way of being Satmar Jews, and therefore they shouldn't be here. A judge isn't going to, that's not going anywhere. So
this very brilliant federal judge, he's one of our most accomplished federal judges, Jed Rakoff, who happened to be a longtime professional colleague and I believe friend of the chief lawyer Kiryas Joel had. These gentlemen were older than me and they were friends, the two of them. And I didn't have a problem with it. Lawyers are friends with judges all the time. But, and after a while in the trial, he just threw up his hands. And he said, Mr. Sussman, I'm going to go into a room with your clients and tell me whether you want the village dissolved. Because we can't have this. And it's obvious that the people running the village here who've testified don't understand that they're operating a government, not a theocracy. We can't have a theocracy. All right?
Was the fire that was believed to be arson related to this? The fire in the women's convalescent home?
It was before this. You're right. It was before this, and it was an issue. It happened, I believe, in 93 or 94, the fire. This was all happening in 97. So it was part of the backdrop. And you're talking about a fire at a place where women came with their infants and they were experiencing the first days of motherhood. That's what you're talking about, right? That fire?
Yeah. Yeah. I thought in my memory that maybe it was connected to the whole thing. So the fire preceded the big moment where the judge asks you if you want to have Kiryas Joel dissolve. The fire story, can you tell us what happened, why it's related?
I remember going with my father to that fire. May he rest in peace. He and my mother were then living in Chester in my home. I remember getting a call on an early Sunday morning telling my father what was going on. And he got with me in the car and we went over there. It was about 10, 12 minutes from our house. And he just started crying. I remember that day very clearly. We probably lost, as a family, historically, many people in the Holocaust and all of that, and sort of come to this. And I remember that day. So, it was a place that apparently was run by, I think the Grand Rabbi's wife was involved in the running of it, and she was by then part of the dissidents. And her house was being disputed. It was right next to the synagogue. And there's this whole crazy dispute going on that I wasn't handling directly. Ben Oster was lawyering that. I got into it, but he was the principal first lawyer. And this whole fire developed, and it was just a horrible sight.
Did you see it while it was in blaze?
Yeah. He got there.
What happened? All the women with their babies were running out?
Yeah.
Was anyone hurt?
I honestly don't remember. I don't remember that anyone was hurt. So I'm not going to say what anyone was. I don't remember that. I remember, though, the scene. It was a very overwhelming scene to understand that a Jew would do that to another Jew. And we'd already been dealing with the rock throwing and the polling place and a lot of other violence. And this was just extraordinary to me that anyone would be involved in it. In my later career, I had a similar incident in Rockland County where a Molotov cocktail was thrown at a man by the butler of the Grand Rabbi down in that group. And it was a horrible situation. I remember feeling the same way in both those, that, here we were among Jews. This is the behavior. It was very difficult to see. Is that why your father cried? My father cried at the arson site where the women were running with their children and the men were there screaming and yelling, and it was very explosive.
Why were they screaming and yelling?
Because they were trying to make sure all the women were out of there. And, they were fearful that people were still trapped in there and they didn't know. And, it's not good.
So how many women were there with their babies?
Lots.
And they were holding their newborns?
Yeah. There were like 80 women, as I remember it, 80 to 100 women. There's a lot of people. It was a big facility.
And they held their newborns when they came running out? I actually don't remember this at all.
I don't know how old you were then, but,
Yeah. I was not, if it was 94, you said 94, I was 9.
So,
Wow.
So
So,
this is
no,
all-
I want to hear your recollections of that moment. I'm just curious if you have any visual memory that you can paint for me so I can see it in my own mind's eye. I would love to, like, what season was it, just so I can kind of have your oral history testimony on this since you were there.
what overwhelms me is the image of my own father, honestly, and how I remember feeling. I don't remember so many details. I remember seeing the scurrying and hearing the men, and I remember, because I was the lawyer, basically getting there, and people were coming up to me trying to tell me, often in garbled way, what had happened, and trying to understand who could possibly do this, and understanding that no one could possibly do this except the other group, and just feeling like I just couldn't believe it had gotten to this, 5 years after I started the Waldman case. And I remember thinking to myself about Herb Davidson, who was my mother's sister's second husband. And Herb Davidson was a band leader in New York City. And when I was a boy, he was a virulent conservative, very conservative, and didn't fit in with the politics of our family at all. But he always talked about the Satmars, and he always used to talk about how they were so violent and vile, and he hated them. And they were anti-Zionist, and he was a big Zionist. And this was the subject of many disputes in the family. And I remember, not believing him, that, a group of Jews could be that violent toward each other. And he would tell me these stories about what would go on in Brooklyn. This was probably in the 60s and early 70s, very early 70s. And now here I was standing 20 plus years later, he was still alive, and seeing this, all that he had told me basically vindicated about the level of violence that could be and was being perpetrated Jew against Jew in this community, which was 10 minutes from my house, and which I'd had a fairly major role by then. The reason I say that is not that many outsiders, were involved. I mean, I was an outsider and I was deeply involved. I mean, it wasn't that usual, as you said earlier. People didn't go to court. So, there wasn't that much intersection between the broader community and what was going on there. And I was one of the people who had pierced that.
Yeah.
And, I knew a lot of the women. And I knew from discussions with some of the women, their views on what was going on.
With a fire in particular?
No, just the general situation. The fire obviously crystallized it and made it more intense. But, there was a feeling of mournfulness. But this, I'm sure
With
this.
regards,
Go ahead.
yeah, I just want to clarify. I just want to go here for a second. With regards to the fire, how did anyone know that it was arson? Was it ever proven? To which degree? Was this a debate?
My memory is that there were clear markings of gas cans that had been poured on different parts of the building and lit. That's what I remember. And I don't remember it being a subject of much dispute that it was an arson. But I saw that with my own eyes at this point. I can't tell you that. I don't remember. I just don't. I don't remember whether I went that close to the building. My memory is I wasn't able to get that close to the building, but what I was hearing from people and heard thereafter was that there were plain signs of it being arson. And I don't remember that being the subject of a lot of dispute, honestly. I mean, what person may have been the subject of dispute, but that it was an arson was not, as far as I recall, contested.
In the book where I read about this arson, and maybe I have a tickle in my memory of this arson, of this fire, but it's mixing in my memory with another fire that happened near our house when I was a child. So I'm not sure if I'm remembering anything correctly. I have a visual memory that couldn't have been this particular fire. It was a different fire. So anyway, in the book, I did read that Mayor Abraham Weeder said we couldn't have done it because my daughter was there with her newborn baby. So I don't know if they vehemently denied it or not. I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't remember there being vehement denials. That's my memory. But again, it wasn't the source of the legal work. I mean, we went there because of being called there, and it was such a iconic type of event, and obviously would be that. And I needed to be there with the people who felt victimized by it. But that didn't. When you started asking earlier about the connection between that and the lawsuit, it was attenuated. There wasn't a firm connection. The lawsuit was about the way building and zoning was being administered. A huge amount of research went into that. And we presented that research, probably about 40 or 50 different properties in the federal court. And after the federal court heard about all of the disparities in administration and then heard the explanations, which were basically religious in nature, we can't let them be here. The court said, well, you can't have a village then, basically. What do you want to do, Sussman? So I remember being in a very small witness room with Joseph and Zalman and others and Kalman Weiss and whoever else was there. And I remember wise people. I mean, they're very wise men. I don't know. It just was one of those terrible, terrible moments because so much was in a way riding on it, at least on some level. And we agreed that dissolving the village wasn't the alternative. That what we needed to do was try to ensure that the village changed and that the men who were controlling the village came to understand that they had to live under the rule of law. They were in the United States, after all. They weren't in their own country. And I felt that was the most important message. And again, it was deeply emotional because, we'd been fighting by then for 8 years, all of this. We had, and as I said before, there were people who were throwing rocks at others who were trying to vote. We had to move the polling place, which we succeeded in doing, into the village of Monroe. Polling place was in the great synagogue and couldn't be there anymore. And, there was just every measure of calamity. And I was embarrassed as a Jew. I felt that, there had to be a better way. So I tried hard to set up this community relations board in which both sides would have members and they would deliberate and try to resolve these issues more rationally. And of course, permission was granted to build the synagogue, and that was done. That was part of the resolution. That's
the Sussman Shul?
Yeah.
And they got a payout towards building that?
They got a payout for the violations of the constitutional rights and whatever else. But, again, I didn't feel the money part of it was as consequential. I thought that the fair administration of the law had to happen, and that if we could try to move in that direction, that would be good. And, I have to leave in a couple of minutes, unfortunately, because I have to prepare for trial that's starting on Monday. But, I'll say that, over the years, and, this is now almost 30 years ago, 28 years ago, it appears that a lot of these divisions have to some extent been mended in the community, and that the vision of a one-state solution, if I can put it that way, has been achieved, and that, there is a degree of cooperation. Now, I ran for county executive this year, and everyone voted against me. So I take that to be a sign that they've achieved a degree of consensus. Wow. That the division of 24 years ago, when I ran for county executive and got 47% of the vote, no longer exists. So the people who I represented must have made peace to their satisfaction with the majority community. I took that as one measure for that, and I accepted if that's what happened, that happened. And it seemed manifest in that. It's kind of irony. But, there are obvious throughout this region, and it's not just in Palm Tree now, South Blooming Grove and up through Monticello and all sorts of other communities. These are amongst the most talked about pressing issues that each community is facing. And it's a recipe for profound anti-Semitism and culture wars and division. Many of the communities I've worked in, there's tremendous antipathy towards Jews, and particularly Satmar. Every single major piece of property that's in our county that I've ever been involved in, the argument for whatever anyone wanted to do on that property was the Satmars can't get it. Build Legoland here, build this here, build that here. Every single discussion is permeated with this, literally.
Wow. Well,
And I think that's a terrible legacy from all of it.
yeah, it's a still developing, evolving story, and this is a serious problem. Before I'm going to let you go, before we wrap up, I think I just want to hear your final thoughts, since for so many years you worked so hard to represent these dissidents in Kiryas Joel, and there were so many setbacks along the way as the leadership quite bullied the dissidents to disempower the dissidents and to deprive the dissidents of basic things like building their own synagogues. And you finally came to this moment where the judge essentially was going to rule in your favor and gave you an option. And the decision that these men, and I suppose you, came to was to not ask for the dissolution of Kiryas Joel. How have you felt about that in hindsight, especially since you have such strong feelings about Kiryas Joel today?
I remember I was representing Satmar Jews. I wasn't representing a group of secular people. And I was representing people whose families had started, in some cases, Kiryas Joel. And these people on both sides had fought with the town of Monroe and struggled to get what they believed to be a voice in this broader town, which, from their point of view, detested them. And of course, I understood that the vision that both sides had for Kiryas Joel was incompatible with the more bucolic vision of that people in Monroe or Woodbury would have for their community. The density in Kiryas Joel is almost a legacy of our tradition. Jews, even as you know, during the 40s, struggling against Nazism, lived in tightly bound communities, whether in Warsaw or any of the other communities. Jews have lived that way for generations. And Kiryas Joel, in a way, is a replication of the type of living environment that many Jews are accustomed to, a more urbanized, very close, almost representative of the closeness they hope to have as a religious group, as between members. I've always viewed the architectural features and the connectivity of community to be very mirroring of each other. And this is very much contrary to the images of what Orange County is to be to many of the other people in the county. So I felt that if you were going to have a government that wasn't of people from Kiryas Joel, first of all, they would end up dominating numerically whatever jurisdiction they were in. And that would lead to all sorts of problems and tensions between us, if you will, as Jews and everyone else. So there was no good answer. I didn't have faith that the people on the other side of the table would really be ultimately fair. And I may have missed that. Maybe they became fair over the years. As I said, there does seem to be some rapprochement here. I don't know all the details of it because I haven't been involved. I've been involved in many other struggles over these last 20 years. So, my own feelings are that, as I said a minute ago, this is, as you said also, this is an ever continuing saga. When you have a group that has a birth rate 4 and 5 times the birth rate of everyone else in the community, the objective reality is they're going to need space and infrastructure that is now possessed by others. And that transition, if there's going to be a transition, is not smooth, particularly because the group hasn't built, except on a sort of superstructure political level, the kinds of associations that are necessary and are not welcome or don't feel welcome and may not be welcome in many parts of the community and are seen as strange or alien in their customs. So, it's a very complicated thing. I think there are ways around it. Had I become county executive at the age of 72, I would have brought these groups together and I would have sat at the long table I promised 24 years ago to create and see what we can do to have dialogue and embrace each other. I don't see the political leadership doing that. I think it's more in their moment to try to cuddle up on the one side under the covers to Kiryas Joel while bashing Kiryas Joel everywhere. And that's what they do. So we can't have Camp LaGuardia be housing in Orange County, even though we have a desperate need for housing, because if it's housing, it's going to be housing for the Jews. So let's make an unnecessary park. We have a 240-acre county-owned property, which is really, within 5 miles from Kiryas Joel. And we can't do an RFP to make the kind of development we need in the county because the only ones who will get it will be the Jews. And, the same story could be said over and over again. So it is a lot of irresolution. And I haven't been able to get myself in a position where I could help really, in a way, resolve it or show a path to resolution. I think I understand how it could be done, but the voters have the final choice, not me.
I see. Michael, you don't have to solve all the world's problems.
There are people who are here who have, whoever they may be, ability and feel that they should work on the world's problems in their own backyard, certainly. And we have these problems here. And, we have an old saying, if not me, who? If not now, when? Yeah. I've always believed that. And my father always told me, never abdicate. If you can contribute to a solution, try to do so, because if not you, who? And that's not to say there aren't other people who can be involved. It's not only one person. It's not a dictatorship and should never be. But even at my advanced age, I still have aspiration of contributing to something that I think is more of a solution than where we are now. And I think where we are now is on very unsolid ground. Anyhow, it's a pleasure to talk with you all this time.
Yeah. And I want to say, before I let you go, I do want to say I'm so touched by your passion and convictions. It is something I feel is a very Jewish thing, that we put our necks out for what we believe in. And it's been really a pleasure to see how you stand by what you believe in. And it's it's so refreshing and moving to see that. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing, and to get to see that side of you, which of course I never knew when I knew Sussman, the lawyer, the bad guy, or Sussman Shul, and so on. So I really appreciate that you gave this.
Well, nice to see you, and good luck with your work as well.
Yeah, thank you.